So over the weekend, Games Workshop released the pre-orders for their new Thousand Suns 10th edition stuff. So they're getting their new codex, they're getting some new dice, data cards, and a combat patrol, but most importantly, they're getting some new models. As you probably know, at Adepticon, they announced the Sekhetar Robots. Unlike World Eaters and Death Guard, who just got a new character model, we got a new bodyguard unit. I couldn't find much lore on these guys, but apparently they go all the way back to the Horus Heresy, and they're kind of a conduit to magic, but also like a lethal statue that they use to protect their most valuable areas and most valuable people. And that seems to be the role that they're going to play in 40k now, is that they're going to be like a bodyguard unit to your sorcerers. So in true GW fashion, these new models are being held behind a Battle Force box for their initial release, and if it's anything like World Eaters and Death Guard, they're going to sell out immediately. So basically, they went up for pre-order over the weekend, they're going to release in 2 weeks, then we gotta wait a couple weeks for the actual models to get announced, and then we gotta wait 2 weeks after they get announced and go up for pre-order. So we're looking at least, I don't know, maybe 5-6 weeks. Well, I don't want to wait that long. So if you know anything about our channel, we're super into Necromunda, and if you know anything about Necromunda, it opens up a wide world of kit bashing, and that is how I'm going to get my robots early. First things first, we have to find a good model to start our kit bash. There are a few I've considered, like the Horus Heresy Thalaxes or Ursaraxes, however you pronounce those. But if we take a look at Mini Compare, a really neat site compares the sizes of miniatures. This isn't a sponsor, I just really like using it for this kind of stuff. These two models are a bit smaller than the Sekhetar Robots, and I think it's mostly in their legs, so maybe with some kind of extending of the legs, these would actually be pretty perfect, and I might actually revisit this idea later on just for fun. But I don't want to buy a whole box if it's not going to work out. But if you do buy a whole box and it does work out, that's 3 kits. There might be a budget video in there somewhere. But that's a video for another time. But anyway, then I thought of a robot that has been kit bashed throughout many Games Workshop games and rarely actually ever used in the one that it was meant for. The UR-025 from Blackstone Fortress. So sure, go out and buy 2 $200 box games for 2 models for this kit bash. Just kidding, there's better ways. But we'll get to that. But you notice on Mini Compare here that the UR-025 is actually about the same size as the 2 Horus Heresy robots that I mentioned earlier, but I mostly chose this guy because of the position of his head. If you notice on the 2 other robots, they kind of have that hunched posture about them, making their head, you know, kind of lower to the center of their chest almost. Whereas UR-025, his head is directly on top, kind of giving him more of that presence. So yeah, his head is about at the Sekhetar Robot's chest, so with a little bit of kit bashing and maybe a bit of basing, I think I can give him at least the same silhouette. But obtaining these guys, that might be the tricky part. On eBay, at time of recording, you can get them from about $20. I got mine a few months back with a game called Combat Arena, which is another all-in-one box game that I know pretty much nothing about. All I know is that it comes with a ton of Games Workshop miniatures for like $35, if you can still find it. It was a Barnes & Noble's exclusive, which I don't think they're selling online anymore, but maybe check your local Barnes & Nobles and see if you can find some. But anyway, it comes with tons of models, some of which are just straight up $35 40k HQ units for Astra Militarum or Imperial Agents or Sisters of Battle, so on and so forth. But basically I bought them because there's some awesome Necromunda kit bashing in here. So I bought 3, and 2 of which are now going to be my Sekhetar Robots. But without further ado, let's actually get to the models. So I separated them from the rest of the sprue in both the kits. So I'm going to do my normal model assembly, carefully removing them from the sprue, which even includes this little foot thing down here on the bottom, which is meant to secure him to his base, but I have to up the size of his base to a 40 mil, so I don't need this guy. And then I carefully sand all the sprue gates and some of the mold lines like normal. They were relatively bad in this kit, but not the worst I've ever seen. But anyway, here he is, if I were to actually keep him like this. He has this little backpack here. I'm actually going to keep this and do something with it, because I feel like it kind of gives him a bit more presence. But what I am going to not keep is these joints. This is a very nerve-wracking part, because if this doesn't work out, this model is mostly ruined. But I want to give him a bit more flexibility down in the legs for different posing purposes. So I'm going to carefully remove his leg from his body here, and then just clean up all the rough-looking plastic from my cuts, and then obviously doing the same for the other side. And a more precise way to do this would probably be a hobby knife, but my current one is dull and I haven't gone out to get a new one. So I'm just going to be as careful as possible with my sprue snips here, and it's doing a pretty good job. Mostly because I don't care about the actual internals of the legs, like the joints. I'm just going to completely redo them. If I was going to try to keep like the little servos and stuff, I'd probably use something more precise. But here's his body. And then just to kind of make room for a joint, I am going to sand this down with a kind of rounded edge, because I want his hips to be able to like pivot like on a ball. And I found the weirdest ball to put in there, and that is the weird rounded bits of a Sisters of Battle power pack. I'm not going to use the whole power pack, but as you can see, it's almost the perfect size. So we're going to go ahead and salvage that from this backpack. And yeah, just get that cleaned up and glued on there, and I think I will have myself a hip joint. Pretty perfect. And to make sure it is well secure and some of these gaps are filled, I'm going to go ahead and use some sprue goo. And then just reinforce it with some regular extra thin, just to make sure. And then ensuring that I get all the way around it, just for a secure fit. But the leg's going to need just a little bit more work to get it to sit in there right, as well as maybe even chopping that bit of texture off from the ball joint. And with that, I'm going to use this little engraving tool. I don't know the actual name for it, but it seems like it's doing the job pretty well, and it seems like almost exactly the perfect size. I just have to make it a little bit wider. And then next up is his arm. This kit is easy to build, so it has these little pegs that help you build it and help it keep together without needing glue. I'm using glue, so I'm going to cut these off for the most part, but you don't have to. I just have to point out that I love these dudes' little arms. They got these little Wall-E style grabby hands, and I really want to keep that at least on one of them, so I'm going to. And this one's going to be the Power Claw one then, so I'm going to use these Zangor axe bits because I equipped all of mine with chainswords, so I have plenty of these to go around. So I'm just going to snip one that is relatively symmetrical, cut it in half, then clean it up a little bit, and then figure out how I'm going to attach this to his arm. I think I'm going to have to get rid of the back part here because it's just getting in the way. So I'm going to cut it off at a nice angle and then attach it. I think I got these both at about the same angle, enough to where they look pretty well symmetrical. And there you have it, just gluing it straight to his wrist. It's pretty simple but effective. Now his other arm, however, he has this like auto gun, Gatling gun type deal, and this is supposed to be where his flamer goes, so I'm going to go ahead and snip this off and then see what we can find to replace it. I just happen to have about 15 of these Infernus Marines sitting around still on sprue, and they have flamers, so I'm going to take one or two. So I'm going to carefully take his hand off here by cutting at the wrist and then cutting off the entire grip assembly, as well as the little holder that goes on top of the gun. And then I'm just going to go ahead and clean them both up. Now it seems to be a pretty solid fit just the way it is, so I don't really have to do anything fancy to connect it. I could go the extra mile and give it a little bit more posability, but statues are supposed to look pretty stiff, so I just put some sprue goo and shoved it in there. And then to help get a little bit of height, I think I'm going to change out the feet for something a little more chaotic. So I'm going to once again carefully remove another piece of the model because I want to give him more of a like clawed foot. But I'm going to go ahead and clean up this joint a little bit here, giving me some room to play around with. And what better claw to use than, you know, the claw that I also used on his wrist, Zangor axes. So we're going to go ahead and kind of measure that up there, and I think that looks pretty perfect as far as size goes, and it even looks like it kind of just naturally fits in there. Once again, splitting the axe head in half, and then kind of cleaning up the inside bits of it, and then eventually using both pieces to create a kind of mirrored bird clawfoot looking thing. I snipped one of the middle bits of the axe off and kind of cleaned it up a bit to give it this little ball joint, just to give me something to glue to the actual leg here, which is looking pretty gnarly, so I'm going to have to clean that up a bit more, but just kind of giving it a little bit of a test fit here. It's really hard to do while holding in front of the camera, so I apologize for that, but I think I get a good angle on what I'm going for, so I just have to sit here and hold it for like 10 minutes while it dries. So now that we have the foundation of what the robot's going to look like, I want to kind of make it a bit more Thousand Suns. And what better sprue to use than a Thousand Suns favorite, the Sorcerer Box. And I think I've already got a pretty good idea of how I'm going to get a little bit more height out of these guys as well. The Thousand Suns love their little collar things in the back of their helmets, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to give him one of these. And it's almost a perfect fit without even having to cut anything, but I am going to cut it just to get that perfect fit so it doesn't pop off when you accidentally grab it or, you know, knock it over or something like that. But almost perfect. So I'm just going to slather in a little bit of sprue goo here to get what little gap there is, and once again, pretty perfect. And then we're going to go over it with some Tamiya Extra Thin again, just to kind of smooth out the sprue goo that was left over when we pushed them together. Now he's starting to look pretty Thousand Sunsy. So the Sekhetar Robots have missile pods on their backs, similar to the Scarab Occult Terminators, and I don't really have any bits to do that, so bear with me here, but the Zangors have these little horns. And I have a bunch of extra of these little horns. So what if instead of like a missile pack, we had a weird magical bird that spit missile-like fireball projectiles or something? My original idea was to use some like Tau missile pods or something, but where's the fun in that? This makes the model a bit extra while also giving it that Zinch look by having, you know, bird heads all over it. So I cut off this little pod here that was for an antenna, and I just slapped this little horn right on it. And it looks kind of goofy, but I kind of like it. But he has to be symmetrical, so I did it on the other side as well. And if you couldn't tell, I really like the bird motif, so on the other robot, I'm going to use the end of what was supposed to be a Thousand Suns Sorcerer's staff, and I'm going to carefully cut off the top part of this robot's head, which would go a lot faster if my sprue snips were actually sharp, but there it is. So, and then the bottom half of this to get a almost perfect connection on this head here. And I can't stress sprue goo enough because it helps for all of these cuts. And just like that, he is looking very birdie. I love it. And then my second robot here, he's going to have a melt-a-gun. So I'm going to use this Legionary melt-a-gun and this Grey Knight's, I can't remember the name of this weapon, but it has a really cool end here with some like wires or coils hanging out of it. So I took that part. Unfortunately, I do have to sacrifice the grabby hand on this one. And I just kind of make that connection here. And it's almost perfect as far as size goes. Once again, more sprue goo to fill in this gap here and make a really good connection. But I'm not going to use that tip, which I probably should have cut off before gluing, but we are going to use the actual melted tip from this Legionary gun here. And I think with the Grey Knight's gun tip, it's just a bit too long. So I launched that piece into outer space, and then make sure not to launch this one into outer space because I actually need it. And I have a melt-a-gun. So our second robot is coming together pretty well. I kept the regular pose on his legs, mostly because I didn't have another Sisters of Battle backpack. But here's the Kitbash so far. I think it looks pretty good. It's a little awkward, but every Kitbash has that stage, of course, until you get some primer on it. I went with Color Forge's purple here because that's the color I want my deep shadows to be, while also keeping them at least somewhat classic blue that Thousand Suns are. So then I hit them with a Zenithal of Monument Blue here, making sure just to hit the tops of the model while kind of bleeding over just a little bit, just so I don't have any completely purple panels. And then to reinforce those dark purple shadows, I am going to hit it with a transparent purple, also from Monument, that I thinned down to a wash consistency just so it didn't change the pigment of the blue on the top too much, which it ended up doing. So I'm going to go ahead and hit it with a second blue Zenithal, but much lighter this time just to keep some of those purple shadows and get more like an effect that I have here that I was going for. And then one of the most annoying parts of Thousand Suns, painting the yellow lines, and then hiding all my mistakes from those yellow lines with some gold trim. I could go way crazier with the gold, as Thousand Suns like to be, but this is what I've got so far. And then, of course, you gotta have your Reikland Flesh Shade over the gold, just to hide all of your mistakes, but also deepening that dark gold without desaturating it like a Nuln Oil or a Agrax Earthshade would do. And then I'm gonna hit the silver parts with this heavy metal from the John Blanche Army Painter set, and I'm not even really gonna give them a highlight just because I don't want them to steal the show from the rest of the model. So I'm just going to leave it this dark silver here. I will put probably a very light dark wash over them, but otherwise, he's coming together once again. But I have one more metallic to do, and that is the bronze for both the flamers and the melted tip here. And for that, I use the Castellax bronze. That's my usual go-to. And then I use bright green here for all of my lenses, and then the canister because I think that these flamers should be balefire flamers, which makes me think of green flames, so that's what he's got. Then carefully I'm going to highlight the little stripes on the neck here, extra carefully because I don't have any wash to cover it up like earlier, but I can always go back and fix it. And then some highlights on these little bird feathers here, and then some extra thin edge highlights around the robot because I don't really like edge highlights that much. But they're looking pretty good. They just need some bases. And speaking of that, this one's going to be a little tricky because they have very thin ankles. For that, I'm going to use some paper clips, and instead of drilling into them because they don't have a lot of plastic there, I'm just going to go ahead and hide the pin behind the ankle here. It's silver, it kind of blends in. You won't really notice it unless you're absolutely looking for it. And then I measured once and drilled twice, as you can see here, but I'm going to go ahead and drill a hole for that pin. I cut the paper clip down to size, and I shove it right in there. With some super glue, this should be pretty solid. I did the same on the other guy, and I actually did it on both feet just for some extra support, but now I can shake them and tip them over, and they're not going anywhere. These guys are looking pretty great so far, in my opinion. They only need one more thing. A nice clean paint around the base here, And I think after that, I'm gonna call these guys done. Well, what do you guys think of my Kitbash here? Is it just way out there, way too extra goofy? Do you like it? Do you think it looks better than the original models? I don't, but I think it looks cool enough, and I think it looks fun, and I think at very least these guys will hold me over until I actually get my hands on some Sekhetar Robots. If you guys made it this far, I super appreciate it, as well as any likes, comments, and subscribes you may leave on our channel. It helps us keep doing what we love doing, and that is talking about miniatures. Until next time.